Well, I'm back in this intimidating spot again, 9 months later, and I recognize that not everybody in the audience was here 9 months ago when we presented the first iteration of the master plan, and because of that, the talk today is going to recover a lot of the ground. I want to, because I think the logic of our presentation 9 months ago still holds true even in the revised master plan that we're going to show. I'm going to be very literal about walking through that first part of the presentation. I apologize to any of you who have seen it and who don't want to see it again, but I think it's a useful sequence, especially as it leads up to the revised master plan today. So I just want to introduce myself for those of you who have not been at any of the earlier presentations. My name is Donald Powers, and my firm, Union Studio, we were founded, and this is significant, specifically for these sorts of issues, for the issue of helping a community wrestle with the issues that they're facing in a way that adds up to a stronger civic environment. Part of my frustration as an architect is that as communities, we've lost civic engagement, and I believe that architecture and the places we make are the venue for the civic engagement. So to the extent that we're able to come into communities and design places that put a premium on the community building aspects of the public spaces you build, that's the kind of project we're interested in. And Newburyport's Waterfront, one of the things that's so remarkable is how committed everybody has been. I mean, it's been 40 years of vigorous debate on what's going to happen with the waterfront. And that suggests to me that people care deeply on both sides. And that's the kind of environment that we enter at our peril. And I've said this before, it's a sort of terrifying thing to sit in front of this group, because I know you are not casual observers who just didn't have anything else to do on Saturday morning. You care deeply one way or the other, and into the breach I step. So why are we here, and why are we here again this time? We're here because the conversation has evolved. A lot of the conversation that happened a year ago and then 9 months ago still is valid, but this time there has been additional information which is brought into the conversation, and we, in good faith, are trying to incorporate that. Many of the comments that have been brought forth have been valid, and the revised plan, I think, reflects a good faith attempt to incorporate that. But I want to go back through the original goals. We were here to explore the possibilities of enhancing the city's waterfront, of making the park a better place. And we continue to be here to do that. But we were also, it was our charge to explore the possibilities of connecting that park more fully to the city to create a better use of the park and the waterfront for all the citizens of Newburyport. Our understandings of the goals and issues have come from our review of the 30 years of public record, which I just reviewed again last night, the whole chronology, all of the arguments for and against a developed waterfront. Our own public workshop in June, where we presented some of our initial thinking, and then we walked down to the waterfront and heard more directly and emotionally the issues that people are concerned of. Our development and our really intense thinking and the development plan that we presented in September, and the stakeholder response to that's come to us over the last 9 months, which has been considerable, both in terms of letters to the editor, to the Daily News, communications that have been relayed to us. Several individuals who may be in the audience have forwarded information to us that we were not privy to before, so all of that's been incorporated. The goals that we work under remain the same. Enlarge the park, the civic space, while preserving an appropriate amount of improved parking. And this is important, the improved parking. Right now the parking is ad hoc on a gravel lot, and even the experience of parking is something that should be improved. It's not just a matter of the number of parking spaces, it's the matter of the configuration of those, and whether the experience of parking at the waterfront also adds to the experience of experiencing the park. We want to improve and enrich the experience of the park without commercializing it. We heard that loud and clear. Even the folks that support development on the waterfront of some sort are not in favor of commercializing it to the extent, I'll show examples of the sort of antithesis, or the example of commercializing the waterfront And it's been clear to us from the beginning that nobody wants to lose the bucolic or the park-like setting at the waterfront. We want to maintain the access and views to the waterfront from Merrimack Street and Water Street and from all of the other view corridors that come down the hill, Green Street in particular, but make the waterfront more inviting all year round, and significantly find a way forward for this project which improves the park, which is self-funding and sustainable. That issue of self-funding and sustainable has been a subject of debate. I know that folks have questioned the assumptions of how much it will cost. We have more information about that now, which we can share later in detail. But the point in any scenario, whether you quibble over the exact number, is that the thing needs to be sustainable in several different categories, one of which is financial. So in the original presentation, I talked about Union Studio's understanding of the world from the eyes of an architect and an urban designer, and I want to walk through that again. We understand the world to be kind of organized. This is a artificial spectrum, but it says that the world is organized as a series of place types, from the most natural to the most urban. And that if you look at the world through that lens, you can start to understand what things should be in certain components. So Newburyport in particular, you see I've got we've listed the natural, the rural, the suburban, the town center, and the urban core, and think of that from being the dunes on Cape Cod all the way to the center of New York City. And it's not just regional like that, it happens within any given town. Itself has these spectrum of place types. Newburyport's downtown is what I call the town center, and I want to take a minute to make a digression which I made before, which is the town center kind of place is America's unique contribution to urbanism. It's that place where the built world and the natural world exist in a rare balance that doesn't happen almost anywhere else in the world. You've got a kind of nice, a loose fit of buildings which are in themselves objects sort of standing alone with separations between one building and the other, knit through with parkland. The other way to look at it is if you look at it from the landscape side of the view and think of it in terms of open spaces. And Newburyport also exists along a spectrum of open spaces. In this view, if you look at everything from the dunes on Cape Cod to Post Office Square in downtown Boston, you have this range of completely natural and untouched by human hands to completely artificial, but still an open space in the downtown of a city. Well, Newburyport, again, occupies that middle ground, that sort of perfect balance that we all understand as sort of small town America. It's the town green with the steeple and the courthouse fronting on it. It's a loose collection, enough to create a strong place where you know you're in the middle of town, but it also is leavened and made softer by the green spaces that are around it. So the reason I emphasize that view is because if you understand the world architecturally and from a placemaking in that lens, it gives you an idea, a way to judge what any given place should be if you're thinking about changing it or making it fresh. And so it's insight for us. It's always been insight for us on what the appropriate nature or balance between the building and the landscape is in Newburyport, particularly at Market Landing Park. So by that, we know automatically, if we understand the place we're working in, that we're not talking about the image on the left. Nobody here, nobody in Newburyport ever wanted to commercialize the waterfront in a sort of honky-tonk way like the Disney Boardwalk or Atlantic City. But likewise, I ask you, is it appropriate that the waterfront, the key asset, remain a gravel parking lot in large measure? It's not that, nor is it a series of dunes. It's something in between. So the questions we were asking ourselves is, what is appropriate here? Should development happen at all on the waterfront side of Merrimack? If no, why not? If yes, how much and of what type? So we went back and looked at what the historical record of the waterfront in Newburyport was, and I know this is all old news to many of you, especially because you've sat through this presentation once before. But it's helpful to understand that it was not always open space. It wasn't anything like open space. But this vibrant waterfront, which was a mix of commercial and restaurant and tavern uses, at the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century had become by 1960 this, a waterfront which still had some vibrant, some commercial activity, but it had largely become blighted, it had been cut off. All of the things that we're arguing for now, which is an attachment, a connection to the waterfront, had been lost. And the waterfront was cut off, it was ugly, and it was not even economically prosperous. So in comes urban renewal, which in my circles gets a bad rap. It's not responsible for a lot of great changes to cities, but in this case, what it did was create a blank slate. So urban renewal in 1968 took a waterfront which was populated roughly at this level and cleared it out to a waterfront which populated mostly at this level. And what replaced it, and what has replaced it, is largely parking lots and Market Landing Park, which was built in 1984, I believe is the date that park was designed. I'm going to do an analysis of Market Landing Park and why this is such a special place, why it's working for you, or why I believe it works as a space right now, and suggest ways that could be made better. But because of urban renewal, Newburyport's use of the waterfront is much different from the prevailing patterns of New England waterfronts up and to the north and south of us. Typically, you find in waterfronts that segued from a heavily commercial activity to a present day, this mix of residential and entertainment and restaurant uses that infills along with marinas and some light industry. This is not to suggest that this is what the waterfront at Newburyport should be, only to say that you have a rare opportunity, which you all know. That's what we've been focused on for the last 40 years. So this is the typical pattern. I'm not even quite sure where all these images are, but this attitude of getting economic activity primarily in a recreational point of view out to the water's edge has been the efforts of most cities that are trying to capitalize on their waterfront. They recognize the economic value of that waterfront, and since it's already developed, they're converting that development into a different sort, which is primarily recreational. The other way, which happens more as an exception to the rule than the rule, is the viewing of the waterfront as something different altogether from the city itself. And I would say I would dare say this is how the folks from the Citizens for Open Waterfront prefer to think of Newbury's waterfront, as a retreat, separate from the city and a place of repose or escape from the city. The problem with this, and this image on the upper left is the Esplanade off of Storrow Drive. The Charles River's to the left, Storrow Drive is to the right. The problem in this scenario is that attitude with respect to the waterfront requires more space, physical depth, than we have present at the moment. And what it requires, and actually Storrow Drive in this case is acting as the barrier, which makes it, once you get over into the Esplanade in Storrow Drive, you're in another world. It's about the waterfront, it's about moving along the edge, you've got a screen of trees, and the city has been left behind. But it requires considerable depth and considerable length for that to happen. An inversion of that would be like Central Park in New York City, where it's so big that you can lose yourself in it and forget about the city altogether. That's another way of thinking of open space, and it's the way we typically, as Americans, tend to think about open space. It is something completely other. There's development over here, and there's open space over there. But that has not been the historical pattern for most of America's urban design. It's always been kind of a balance, more of the town green sort of open space than the Central Park sort of open space. So for Newburyport, this is both a unique opportunity and a challenge to provide a place of retreat, but also a connection to the city. So the way the park is currently working is, to us as sort of wonky architects and urban designers, it's very interesting. We sort of analyzed it to understand what was the best way you would intervene to make more of the good stuff and take away the bad stuff. It acts as both a meander in terms of the water's edge and a gathering place, but it doesn't do any of those as well as it possibly could. Obviously, I said before in the first presentation, well, there are problems with Market Landing Park, and people just jumped on me and said, there is nothing. We love this park. So obviously, I retract that, and I concede that everybody loves Market Landing Park and the boardwalk out at the water's edge. But there are opportunities, I believe, as an urban designer, as someone who's honestly trying to balance all the concerns of your community, there are opportunities to make it more of the stuff you enjoy. So looking at it, we have three kinds of space. We have the centralized sort of gathering space. This is a formal space that was designed by a landscape architect, which has the stage at one end and has the boat basin as a central access. We have the informal buffer space, which is all of that loose green stuff that's around the edge, which happens between the central part of Market Landing and the parking areas. And then we have the linear, or the kind of the boardwalk space, which is more about an edge that you move along than some place that you sit in the middle of. And we wanted to look at the experience of both of those again. Many of you have seen this before, but the edges of the main public space, the central gathering space of Market Landing Park, are primarily made up by the pathways that ring the perimeter and a loose edge of landscape. And it's working. It works really well. When you sit in the middle of Market Landing Park, you feel like you are removed from the hustle and bustle, from the traffic. It's a great place to have a picnic. But it lacks, it's working in spite of things that landscape architects and architects would consider its lack of closure, to use jargon. So that central focalized gathering space, its landscape buffer is diffuse and it's too thin to really enclose the space. So the experience at the edges, if you're doing anything other than looking out at the boat basin, you're looking left or right, you're looking through the trees at parking or at the backs of buildings that are, and so you have this view of the parking right here, another view of the parking to the east, and especially in the winter when the leaves are off the trees, that view is even stronger. But it's also working as a centralized gathering space. All of the lines, the architectural lines, the enclosure of the tree lines, the stage itself provides a setting where this is where you go if you're going to have wedding photos taken or if you're going to have a small concert on the waterfront. Everybody wants to be in this space. So is there anything you could do to make it work better, or should you just leave it alone, don't touch it? But the way it works currently suggests how it might be improved. And I said last time that the one space, the one building that does have a presence on Market Landing Park is this building that we're in right now, and its cafe, which fronts on the water. This image on the right suggests what I mean there, in that the tower and the porch of the Firehouse Cafe tends to create a closure that lets you know as you've entered Market Landing Park that you've entered a space. And having the two bookends of the stage and the cafe help to create this sense. It's certainly not diminishing the experience of Market Landing Park, and we would argue that it's the one instance where you have this in-between, or this hinge between the architecture and the landscape, which actually, to all reports, I haven't heard anyone say that is not a successful arrangement. The edge space, the circulation in the boardwalk, has another character altogether. And you can see that people love this. When you walk out into Market Landing Park, you're going to move out to the water's edge, you're going to move along it. It's interesting, however, that you're not always moving along the edge. People like to sit at the edge, and part of the reason they want to sit at the edge there is because of the closure that the trees at the background and the berm create. And that helps to create this sort of room. It's an outdoor room is another piece of jargon that architects use, but there's the focal point of the water, there's a clean backdrop behind you that's sort of enclosing you, and you've got the grade change of the berm itself where those benches nestle up to it, and it feels like a place because it's enclosed on one side and it's got an open prospect on the other. You can see how busy this is and how folks go out of their way to occupy a spot on that edge. You can see the woman sitting on the chair up on that a green space right there, but if you step back, you see that just behind that berm is the experience of the parking. And that's something although it's working right now, there's no need for it to be that tenuous. You could have more green space. So this experience right here, when you step back a little bit, you can see how present the parking is to the experience of that park, particularly at the point where you want the most green space, which is right as you round the corner from the boat basin to the boardwalk. Right, the only thing that's being held there is a couple of trees and a narrow, probably 15 or 20-foot space of green space on which people perch at their peril just to get some green space close to the water. Right now, there are several opportunities for visual and pedestrian connections, but most are weak or incomplete. So you've got this kind of connection or way to the water, which is the view. Obviously, you see the water, but there is landscape at the edge, which is obscuring that somewhat. We have other views that go through buildings that are fully obscured by landscape, so the view to the water is not exactly as direct as it might be. And there are very few mixes of uses, as I said. The only real mix of use or additional use besides passive recreation on the waterfront is that one area, that one buffer area between the cafe and the park itself. And this, by all reports, is successful. So it has connections to downtown, but it happens on the backside of the buildings, and in this building, it serves as the only real gateway from Merrimack and Water Street to the park side. I want to lay in one more level of consideration. That's the physical and regulatory framework under which we've been working. This is incredibly complex, and this itself, even if you didn't take into any of the other concerns of the community of Newburyport, is going to make any intervention on the waterfront be very specific and very minor. This, I'm not going to walk you through every detail of this slide, but this is several of the overlaying constraints. You've got Chapter 91, you've got mean historic high tide water, you've got setbacks that happen as a course of zoning, you have restrictions on non-water dependent uses. All of these things add up to create in any scenario, a possible development footprint which is pretty limited. So back to the goals. We want to enlarge the park, the civic space, while preserving an appropriate amount of improved parking. So right now, this is the extent of the park as you see it. The experience is split between this the experience on the right hand where you can get out to the water's edge, and the experience on the left hand where the parking is present in, or at least you have to have a willful disregard or a willful ignoring of the parking right behind you at every moment. The parking gets up closest to the area where you want the most depth in the green space. So in these areas right here, this is the opportunity that we saw as a way to increase the actual green space on the waterfront in the place where you want to increase it, and also simultaneously screen that green space and the waterfront from the parking. We want to improve and enrich the experience of the park without commercializing the waterfront. So again, we said what we want to do is balance this this green character to this space with some activity or some additional resource. It's not an either or, it's an add in to. And that's one of the things that, a little digression that I wanted to make, which is in a lot of the discussion that's happened publicly, there's been this, what I believe is a sort of false dichotomy. It's between either the proponents of an open waterfront or the proponents of a developed waterfront. And that ignores all of the nuance, which I hope will come through in this presentation. Those two things can coexist so long as they are not described absolutely in both cases. So how do we get more of Main Street, which comes into the park itself? How do we get more of the experience of Firehouse Cafe in a way that doesn't disrupt the green nature of the space? In our original study, we identified these two areas as places where if buildings were located in that general area, we thought that they would not impinge too greatly on views to the water, and they could bracket a park, which the landscape architect who was present at one of the meetings, he acknowledged when they designed that park, they always imagined that it would have a closure on the east and west. So we want to maintain the access to the views and to the waterfront, and we want to increase its relevance all during the year. Right now, despite some hardy souls who go down there in the winter and some hardy souls who go down there at night, most people would acknowledge that it's underused during the winter and in the evening hours. But a small amount of program could change that completely. Just one cafe that's open until 9 o'clock at night somewhere in the vicinity of that park could activate and provide critically this thing that planners like to call eyes on the street or eyes on the park, which having that establishment makes it safe for everybody else to be there, where having no eyes on the park and no kind of official activity leaves it to descend to its lowest common denominator and make it difficult for people to feel safe there. And we want to find a way forward which is sustainable. And sustainable, as I said before, is usually talked about as environmental or social. We're talking about fiscal sustainability here. And as I said before, there have been debates about how much it would cost to improve the park. I've heard estimates from as little as $1 million to improve the park. Our conservative estimates, and we have this being run through a professional cost estimator right now, suggest that the improvements that we are proposing are going to cost anywhere between $3.5 and $5 million. So whether you debate the actual amount, and maybe we're off by 30%, it doesn't matter. There is a significant cost there that's going to need to be addressed. So we want to frame the views to minimize the impact of the parking, enhance connections, let the Main Street participate in the park and not turn its back on it, and have a better park and a better downtown. So what is appropriate to do to accomplish all those goals? Like I said, we want more of this, and we've been trying very hard to find ways to do that. But, and this is an image that I used early on in this conversation, this is an image, again, I don't know where this is. I picked this image out because it suggests in a way that I hope you'll be able to concede, suggests a soft presence of architecture and development on a park space. The building, which is 2 stories, which sits in the background behind a screen of trees, is not really detracting from the experience of that park, but it is in this view, and I'm just talking about this view, not the specifics of this place or what actually is or what isn't, just the impression that this view gives you. It suggests that that backdrop of buildings through the trees creates a sense of closure, a sense of place, and very legitimately offers a series of amenities to anybody in that park that it's hard to, from my point of view, to argue would be disruptive to the experience of someone who just wanted to sit in the park. So the proposed master plan process, I wanted to walk you through. This is the available developable land. There's a little caveat, which I'll get to at the last part of this, which is that we have claimed in this diagram one portion of the green space that we believe by deed and legal document is the control of the NRA, but by custom and public perception is not. So in the last part of this presentation, we've said, okay, it doesn't matter whether or not the NRA has legal standing to that part of the land, we're going to give it back because we are committed to not decreasing the park space. So you've got this much developable area. This is what we presented the last time. If you take away from that the existing circulation routes that you need to access both the Fisherman's Pier at the end and the existing businesses along Water Street, you lose that much developable area. If you take away the mandatory setback from the waterfront, from the mean historic high tide, you lose that amount of developable area. If you take away another layer, which I would call as our voluntary setback, and that's the area where, just as designers, we recognize the purpose of this space is to get people to the water's edge. So putting a building on the water's edge, while it might satisfy the people who own that building or occupy that building, takes away a civic good, which we wouldn't want to do. So we said, in any case, we're not going any closer than this blue line. So all of that area is gone for development. Then we start layering in the ways to the water, which I believe it was in the 70s, the court cases in the 70s established the primacy and the enforcement of the historic ways to the water. And those have some flexibility in terms of the fact that the way the law is written, the ways have to be preserved. They can be modified a few degrees left and right of where they currently are located if that improves the condition, but the spirit of the law is that those ways to the water must be maintained. So we maintain those, and when we take this one right through, it cuts off that part of the developable area. There is another way to the water which already exists as parkland, and that's coming down at the bottom of Green Street, and we're going to take away that because we're not going to touch anything in that area. That work has already been done. Now we have the view corridors. As you move along Water Street and onto Merrimack Street, you have view corridors that exist. And it's our stated intention that we're not going to minimize the current visual access to the waterfront that exists right now. We're only going to improve it. Everything about this is improving the experience of the waterfront, not compromising and making something worse. So if you layer in all of those view corridors. This last one that I just laid in, I'll do it again. Currently, that's one that in our original scheme, it ended in a mature grove of trees. So we were contending that that view corridor doesn't exist now, and we were going to let the building be apparent from that viewpoint so that people knew there was development in the waterfront. We've since amended that, and I'll show you that in a minute. But as I go through the site and I layer in all of these view corridors that are really constrained by existing angles and views as you stand out there on the waterfront edge, and you layer those all in, and you take away the resulting development area, you're now at two small areas that have satisfied the criteria of maintaining the ways to the water and the view corridors that exist. We layer into that some of the considerations that I talked about, framing this space and creating an enclosure, and that any good outdoor space, whether that enclosure is made by landscape or by structure, feels better when it has limits to it, or bookends, or if you want, the walls of the outdoor room. We also noticed that on Merrimack Street, there's currently a tooth missing in the street frontage. As you move along Water Street across by the Firehouse Cafe to the parking lot there, you see all of a sudden the edge of the waterfront, the edge of the street is lost, and that benefit of having a strong commercial corridor could be made better by holding the street edge at that point. And then finally, when you connect those two, you get a chance to create a frontage as you move along the sidewalk that both deflects to address Merrimack Street, curves in to create the entrance to the park, and then finally brackets the experience of Market Landing altogether. We pointed out how it was very much our intent that any new buildings we put in this location would have a similar scale to the existing stuff. So you can see right here, I've highlighted all of the existing rooftops of the buildings along Water Street. And we're contending that anything new we put in that location would be of a similar scale. One of the things we noticed, or we made the observation, that the buildings themselves in this configuration were larger in terms of real footprint, but that we were going to make them up of 3 blocks connected by a lower thing so that the scale felt similar to the existing architecture. We've since retreated from that, and I'll show you what that results in a little bit later. You see how in this scheme, it made an important space. And that's the space that's formed by the side of the Firehouse Cafe and right here. And this, if you go out and walk through the space, you will notice that this space right here feels different from this space right here. It's even demarcated by the path lines that come into it. And we understood that that was sort of the entry point or the vestibule that brings you into the park, and that should be framed and made more explicit. And what was, it also provides a sense of arrival as you move down the sidewalk through here. All of a sudden you were fronting a building that brought you into that space right there, and then set up the entrance into the park. So it's sort of an esoteric design element, but it's not so esoteric. We noticed that somebody, whoever located the existing convenience facilities that are located right here and here, did so intuitively in a way that reinforces that notion that that's the entrance to the park. That's something a little bit different than this part, and so it should be framed. They located this perpendicular to Merrimack Street, and they located this to front into the park. So I'm not stating this as a scientific proof that our design genius is somehow confirmed. I'm just saying that two people who are thinking about the problem from totally different realms arrived at the same observation that that was a good place to put buildings. So the green space as it exists now was enlarged in our last proposal to be by this amount right here. Not all of it is absolutely green. Some of it is made up in pathways. But the thickness of that zone right there and the thickness of this zone right here creates an area that now you can occupy without having you can see the remnants of parking, and these were job trailers or something that were parked out there. That's where it was before, and this is where it is now. And the amount of green space that was being added is apparent. That was our scheme in September. Those two buildings in that much green space And it corresponded very closely to our initial observations that given the inefficiency of the way the parking was going right now, this was an opportunity for additional green space, that we were going to thicken up this edge, and that we were going to locate buildings here and here, and that corresponded to our original presentation in June of last year. So the open space connections that we wanted to point out are that in this case, the original scheme, we had buffers from the original market landing space to the proposed buildings. We were maintaining those. And we were presenting a scheme that took an existing 3.7 acres and proposed 4.8 acres. The main difference being that while we lost an area in the original scheme that we believed was actually within the NRA's purview because of the property lines as they're defined, we were trading that for space over here and here, and the net result was 1.1 acres of additional green space. And I'll show you how that's different later. As I said, this area was a loss, a net loss, and this was the net gain. When we look at the difference between the original or the existing condition right now in section, you can see what I talked about before, how the berm and that is just the thinnest, it's just the barest amount of landscape that's helping contain the boardwalk and create a nice experience out there, and the parking is right up on you, and you have to willfully disregard it but if you look at a section through the new space, the new enlarged space, you can see that just by the very nature of the depth of it, we're maintaining the berm height, but we're extending it out another 80 feet or so on average. It's a tapering space, so it's narrower in some and wider than others. This is about at the middle. But you can see the net experience at the waterfront is much greater. Add to that the fact that we are incorporating the long sought for bike connection that would bring you through the site and back out here with hopes that eventually it will connect on the west and east. And then you add in all of the enhanced ways to the water that we have more ways to the water here and here. That's been enhanced. This way has been enhanced by its location along a building. And then you talk about the ways that we had moving across the site, and the net result was that we, as part of our original goal, which was to enhance connections to the waterfront and from the waterfront and within the waterfront, that this scheme did that. And I just want to state again, because you may be saying to yourself, why are you showing this old scheme? We saw it a year ago. Because all of the thinking that went into this is still valid. And that's why I insisted on going through this again, because otherwise the logic of the revised scheme doesn't make any sense if you don't know that it's the same logic that generated the first scheme. So the proposed master plan is just that, a master plan. It's not the architecture. So we want to give you some idea of what the architecture would be, and we don't need to labor on this because you see it all around you. All we were doing was proposing that anything that gets built on the waterfront needs to respect the patterns, the traditions, and the materials of what you find in Newburyport all around you. So we thought it would be helpful just to reiterate what those patterns and traditions are. And typically, all through downtown Newburyport, you see a first layer of retail, which typically has a higher scale. It's maybe 16 feet with a sign band and awnings and larger windows. They happen all over. And then above that are 2 stories, which were originally probably office or mercantile, and many of them have been converted to condominium units. I just got a statistic this morning that right in this area of Merrimack and Water and the downtown area, there are at least 100 condominium units within 150 or 200 yards of this area, and if you expand the net a little wider, it gets up to 120 or so. I can go through the specifics of that if anyone wants to know that, but that's just to point out that currently people are living downtown, and in the world, in the mind of an urban designer, that's a good thing. You want people living downtown. It's what activates all of the public spaces, provides those critical eyes on the public realm that make sure that the people that are there are the people that should be there. So our proposal just repeated that same pattern. So you can see we had 1 layer of retail fronting on Market Landing Park, and then above that we had 2 layers of residential space that was happening within a roof line that was implying just 2 stories. So there's 1 2 stories below the eave line, and then the 3rd story is within the roof line as if it were dormers or any of the other ways. So it's a relatively, the feel of the building would be, we call it 2.5 stories. It's 2 stories plus space in the roof. It would be very akin to this, and the forms that we'll show a little bit later are coming right from this language of stuff. Likewise, the landscape architecture is the same pattern. You've got a nice tradition of these granite piers marking the ways to the water, brick pathways, wooden boardwalks, brick with granite edging, and a loose, in the world of landscape architecture, they would call it sort of romantic landscape as opposed to a formal landscape. It's formal in places with hedges, but generally we would continue with that same pattern of material and approach to the landscape. Oh, sorry, wrong way. So these were the views that we showed last time, and we hoped that those were convincing, that you could see how much green space was actually being gained for the community. And we hoped that you would see that these buildings nestled respectfully at the edges and at the back of that green space. And I think many folks, and maybe perhaps some of them here tonight, did see that and felt comfortable with this, but many didn't. And so that's one of the reasons we've gone back to the drawing board. This was the view from sort of an aerial view above Merrimack Street, looking back out to the water. There's the boat slip. Here is one of our new buildings, and this is the other building, that funny shaped building that wrapped around the corner. This was a view at the ground level, showing what it would be like to walk from the entrance off of Merrimack Street. You can just see the edge of the Firehouse Cafe over here. You're walking along the edge, turning the corner and heading down to the blue of the water and the sail there, and that's another of our buildings across on the other side, on the east side of the park. So what this did, this preserved, these were the goals that we set to do. We preserved and framed to minimize the impact of the parking. We enhanced the connections. Main Street no longer turned its back on the asset. We made the waterfront a year-round amenity, a better park, better downtown, and we found a way to fund all this through the development revenue of that. But folks had objections, and many of these were legitimate, so we brought that to bear. In our new scheme, as I said once before, we took what had been a net increase of 30% green space and a total park area of 4.8 acres, and we gave back the space that was in question. So again, I said legally I believe this is NRA property, but by custom and by public perception it is not. So that space came down into our new open space plan, and that took the net difference between them from 3.7 acres of existing waterfront with a 35% increase to 5.0 acres. That space is roughly 0.2 of an acre right there. The lines of that, by the way, it's been surveyed in different locations. We went off of, instead of a survey line, we went off of the aerial where the green space actually was and tried to preserve that. So that space right there, and also we decided that the building that we had located along this edge was too close. Although it was staying outside of the parkland itself, it required some buffer that we weren't giving it. And so we attempted to move it out of that location. So you can see how when you lay over the new consideration with our existing plan, our old plan, you can see where that building sits within the green space that was currently being occupied, and this building was intruding on what we considered to be an important buffer. Going back through the developable area diagram and taking out now this way to the water, which we felt like we were making an argument that didn't exist now, and so we could obscure that view. We now decided we're not going to try to do that. We've also been made aware of an additional view corridor from Unicorn Street that's been important to maintain. And further, we wanted to make sure, because there were concerns, that Green Street's view corridor would not be impinged. We don't believe it ever was in any of our schemes, but we want to make explicit that that view corridor, as you come down Green Street, would not be affected by anything we would be doing. So those buildings now, in this scheme right here, have sort of stepped back slightly. And a couple of other things have happened. One, before, although we were expressing these buildings as smaller volumes connected by what I call a hyphen, we actually realized that that's not, and the kind of Baroque form of that with all the angles was not really something that you see too often in Newburyport. So one of the goals in taking this back out of there was to simplify the building into more rectangles like you find everywhere else downtown. Separate this building literally so there's a way through it, which is like the other ways to the water here and here and here, and to make these three much simpler buildings that stayed completely out of all green space, existing or not. And then what that did as well is it frees up. In the original scheme, we had this pinch point where the bike lane was coming through right here. And we were convincing ourselves, I believe, that that conflict wouldn't be too bad as bikes rode by cafes at the bottom of these things. In point of fact, that was a troublesome point right there and there. These buildings were a little too close. And the way from the west to the east was a little convoluted as you went through a covered passageway out to here and around. In the new scheme, we've pulled the buildings back, created another buffer between this and Market Landing Park, and now the bike path can move through with a layer of landscape between it and any development. The architectural character is the same in terms of its inspiration. We're just going off what we find and we're replicating those forms. So a view of this building from that location suggests an architecture like that, where you have a brick base on top of a brick top on top of a granite base. These would be rough-hewn granite piers, storefront and canopies below, series of divided light windows. The long side of the building right here shows up here as a two-story building with the dormer suggesting the third floor, and then the elevator occupies that right there. So that's just to give you a sense of what that architecture might be. At the end of the building, again, this view, you're looking at that face, but you're also seeing the slanted side along here. So that's receding in the distance, but you can see that simple mill architecture. I think many of you, if you walk around after this presentation, you'll see that form of roof repeated many times around Newburyport. A view from the water, this was the original perspective, and you can see, I'm going to toggle back and forth so you can understand what the buildings have done. It's slight, but it's an improvement, and I give the credit for that improvement to people who have pushed hard and said we want an even softer relationship of the architecture to the park space. So toggle back and forth. You can see those buildings stepping back even further. And then we had an idea that we've rendered this as a simple building, which could be any number of things. And I want to point out the possibility this is not absolutely definitive in terms of what that building would be. The development process and the public process will determine that in more detail. But we thought, how great would it be if at the end of this building, up above the tree canopy, you had a second-story cafe or third-story cafe where there was a restaurant at the end of that building, and you could come up to the top level on a summer evening and have drinks and dinner on a deck overlooking the river in a way that takes some of the activity off of here. Likewise, at the base of the building, there would be cafes spilling out in this location. Notice the buffer that's happening between this building and anything at Market Landing Park. And when you go outside after this presentation, remember this image as you see where the footprints have been located, because I think you'll agree with me that they feel even more removed from the actual center of the park than this drawing even suggests. A view from over Merrimack Street. This is what we originally proposed, and you can see right here the footprint of the angled shaped building with its cafes directing you in a path along to the water. And you see the original building right there, which was sort of mannered a little bit, but also sitting up on the edge right there. And in this scheme, the building is now stepping back completely out of that, opening up to guarantee that, or to make even more protected the view corridor from Unicorn Street and from above the higher parts of the town, and to create even more buffer between the park itself and the building there. We're suggesting all of this cafe life because in our view, if you're going to do this, what these buildings really want is that additional element to the park. Again, my contention is it's not taking anything away. In fact, it's giving more green space, but it's also adding at the edge of this an amenity that everyone's going to love, I believe. There you can see in this rendition, we don't have the second-story porch. That's just a simple bar building with the elevator there. We were picking up on the tower of the firehouse and repeating that element to kind of help give this place a little character. And this, I apologize for the choppiness of this and the rough hewn, but it's a animated fly-through, walk-through of the space to help as best we could with the limited time and resources we had to communicate even more faithfully what the experience at the bottom of this park is. In the back, you see the Firehouse Cafe. We're moving along in front of the stage to the west right now. This is one of the new buildings right here. It's rendered in white, coming up the steps, and then we're moving through the center of Marketplace Park back towards Merrimack Street. As we get to Merrimack Street, we'll turn towards our building and out onto Merrimack Street. Now you can see that's the face of our building fronting on Merrimack Street. We're rising up to get a sense of what the whole park feels like. There's our other new building over there. Now we're going to come back down and walk along the sidewalk here. You can see the cafes spilling out with the movable planter boxes and people occupying the edge. We're moving along towards the water, and then we're going to turn to our right and go back over towards the stage. Move across the stage and then over towards our new building. You can see again the cafe life at the base, moving along that edge and turning around again to face the water. If anyone's getting seasick, I apologize, I am too. Now you're looking back at the boat basin, the boat slip. And turning around. I'm going to need Dramamine right about now. Again, you see the Firehouse Cafe back there. So that's a rough estimate of what it would be, but we did our best with the computer power that we have. So to recap, the original plan satisfied all these goals, we believe. We believe that the new plan, which I just tabbed to, also satisfies these goals. We don't think anything's changed in our logic between the reasoning that got us to this plan and the reasoning that got us to this plan. But in addition to the benefits that accrued to the first plan, we've also added these additional features. All development now better respects the existing green spaces. We thought it did before, it does so even better now, NRA owned or not. There's an increased buffer space between the buildings and Market Landing Park. There's smaller separate buildings on the west replace the single larger building, helping to break down the scale. The new building locations better preserve all existing views and ways to the water, and the best real estate is potentially given to the most public uses in the form of this upper level restaurant and deck, which I think would be the showpiece of Newburyport, and you'd have a lot of folks coming to experience that. So with that, I just want to suggest that you currently have this, and it's a great asset to the community. I just don't think it's the full benefit that you could have from your waterfront. And this image is the one that I'd like to leave you with as something to work towards. I have done my absolute best, and everybody in our office has done our best to really, really respect all of the fears and concerns about such a special place. And I so hope that the community goes in this direction, because I think I would love to come visit it. Thank you.